100 days of war. Seems as good a time as any to have a breakdown of the situation and see if anyone is closer to winning this thing, or if we're going to be having another video like this in 3 more months' time. So then, to get a full picture of things, we will divide this video into 4 general sections, and then have a look at each of them in turn. These 4 sections will be the Northern Front, the Eastern Donbas Front, the Southern Kharkiv and Black Sea Front, and at the end we will be having a look at the world at large, since the Ukraine conflict has affected a great deal of nations far beyond its borders. Let us start with the quiet area, shall we? The Northern Front. This area has remained more or less quiet since the aborted Russian offensive towards Kiev and Chernihiv. The Russian troops, belonging primarily to the 36th, 35th and 41st Combined Arms Armies and the 2nd Guards Combined Arms Armies, had all left Ukraine by April 6th, with many moving south towards the redoubled Donetsk offensive and some moving back in reserve for refitting and reorganization. But even in the absence of Russian military formations, the threat to northern Ukraine remains, in the form of Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus. Lukashenko is by many considered to be little more than a Russian puppet, and judging by the free movement of Russian troops across Belarus, including of course the Belarus-Ukrainian border, the accusations certainly seem to hold some water, to the point that many have been surprised by the absence of Belarusian troops during the invasion. An absence that may be explained by a de facto revolt in the ranks of the army. Now, bear in mind, these suggestions that troops were ordered to fight but refused comes from the head of the Belarusian opposition party's current leader, whose husband has been jailed by the government for 18 years because he led a protest. She has every reason, understandably so, to make Lukashenko's government look weak. Nevertheless, until further corroboration arrives, I would take the claims with a pinch of salt. And assuming the military still remains in Lukashenko's control, it could well pose some threat to Ukraine. The Belarusian army consists of between 40 to 60,000 active personnel, with another 300,000 reserves. They are armed and equipped with old Soviet equipment, far more outdated again than that used by Russia itself. Qualitatively, therefore, they aren't too much of a danger, but 40 to 60,000 soldiers rolling over the border will always be a concern, especially across such a long frontier. Luckily, the border areas are mostly swamps, forests, and difficult terrain with very few roads, a problem that eventually spelled the undoing of the original Russian attack on Kiev. And so the area can be held quite easily by second-line formations, and that is precisely what Ukraine has done, as the defense of the Northern Front has been given over almost entirely to the National Guard, with a couple of regular military formations held in reserve. Unless something really drastic happens, Belarus mobilization level drastic, I would imagine this front will remain static for the rest of the war. Now we move south to the Black Sea and Kherson, a most decidedly unstatic front, where over the course of the last few weeks, the Ukrainian army has launched several localized offensives, aimed presumably towards the city of Kherson or the hydroelectric dam and bridge at Nova Kakhovka. The Russians have in turn been launching counter-attacks as well, with a constant back-and-forth fight occurring. Now, I did also do a video highlighting the possibility a while ago of seizing the hydroelectric dam at Nova Kakhovka, as it would provide very tempting access to the rear of the Russian lines without going through the by now almost certainly heavily fortified city of Kherson. Mind you, it was a rather harebrained scheme I came up with, so it is far more likely that the Ukrainian army's objective is simply to control or destroy the bridge crossing and the northern bank of the Dnieper, so as to secure their flank and rear for an anticipated siege of Kherson, which is likely to follow. And it will be a siege. It took the Russians the best part of 3 months to take Mariupol, and that was a city fully cut off, whilst Kherson will be able to be resupplied and reinforced at will by the Russian defender. Honestly, the Ukrainians are going to have to pull off more than one miracle if they want to seize Kherson quickly. Despite this, though, an attempt must be made, as the occupying force has very clearly been trying to legitimize their stay. Talks of a referendum, the Crimean style, or even straight-up annexation into Russia has been quite frequent. The only way to stop this is to present Moscow with the specter of humiliation. If Putin officially declares Kherson Russian, and then it falls into Ukrainian hands next week, it would be a tremendous embarrassment inside of Russia. That's the important part. Russia's international reputation is already in tatters, but the Russian people themselves still, many of them, believe in victory, and they believe in what they see on their media channels. If a part of Ukraine is declared liberated and then unliberated again, that's the kind of stuff that's more difficult to explain away. In much the same vein, Ukraine's attack towards Kherson may also be a bit of an act for the galleries. Many Western nations are currently considering the dispatch of heavy hardware to Ukraine, like main battle tanks and more self-propelled artillery. If Ukraine can demonstrate a willingness and ability to use these weapons decisively, it will no doubt help Western leaders make their decisions. It will be costly, though, and slow. The conflict has in many ways degraded into a massed artillery duel. And so, whilst Ukraine has shown an ability to maintain offensives and steadily seize ground, they have, much like the Russian army, by and large not demonstrated an ability to create a breakthrough attack. Meaning any forward move will be harassed and beaten up every single solitary torturous step of the way. Potentially even more so, as the Ukrainian offensive brings it closer to cruise missile range launched from the Black Sea. As of course, we have to mention the Black Sea, which is completely dominated by the Russian Navy. Most of the surface ships have, mind you, started clearing out of the area as the threat of Ukrainian Neptune missiles and, arriving in ever greater numbers, Western harpoons place their continued presence at considerable risk. However, there are no effective weapons against Kilo-class submarines, handily able to surface and fire off cruise missiles and then dive again with absolute impunity. This naval supremacy has allowed Russia to also create a de facto blockade of Ukraine. Now, Russia has not officially declared a blockade, but the presence of warships and Kilo-class submarines plus cruise missiles attack on Ukrainian ports makes it pretty clear what the likely fate of blockade-breaking ships would be. Furthermore, Ukraine has also mined the waters around their primary ports and the main approaches. This was done, obviously, to discourage a Russian naval invasion, but it presents just as much of a hazard and deterrent to civilian shipping as well. And without that shipping, without that trade, a wide-reaching problem has been created on the food market for practically the whole damned world. Moscow has offered to open a food corridor, but only if Western sanctions are lifted and Ukraine demines the waters, something Ukraine so far has been unwilling to do. Understandably so, as the spectre of a Russian naval invasion has hung heavy over southern Ukraine ever since the invasion. Now, that is another topic I have made a full video on in case you're interested, but the short version of it is that right now, a naval landing against Odessa, for example, is theoretically possible, but would be absurdly risky and likely insanely costly. It might also no longer be necessary, as with Russian control of Snake Island and with ever more weapons apparently being shipped to the island, Russia essentially already sits astride Ukraine's largest and most important trade route. Alright, they can't take the ports themselves, but if no ships can enter or leave, the ports remain neutralized. This is also why this is the front where we are most likely to see some drastic changes, in my opinion. The West is getting very, very nervous about the potential of a food shortage, as Ukraine produces nearly half of the world's sunflower oil, 37% of millet cereal, 13% of the world's barley, and 10% of the world's wheat. Many countries have seen 30% or more increases in certain food prices since the war started, and I hasten to point out, that is before the actual shortage begins hitting the market. This will undoubtedly mean that Ukraine will be under a great deal of pressure to use all of those new toys, including Harpoon anti-ship missiles, to start securing food exports, as the West is very unlikely to intervene directly, as doing so would be very inflammatory. Now, we move on to the big focal point at the moment, the Donbas front. And I can think of no better example to demonstrate Russia's realignment of strategic priorities in the war than this front. Initially, it was to be an enormous war-ending pocket, with Russian armored forces sweeping down through and around Kharkiv, seizing much of Ukraine's tanks and vehicle manufacturing in the process, whilst marine and mechanized elements came up from the south to secure the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. If successful, not only would this have secured half of Ukraine in a gulp, it would have trapped more than a third of the Ukrainian military in an enormous pocket, which in all due likelihood would have ended the war then and there. This, however, turned out to be a bit beyond the Russian army's capabilities. And so the plan was adjusted and downscaled. After the complete withdrawal from northern Ukraine, elements of the combined arms armies were sent to reinforce an offensive southeast of Kharkiv, presumably aimed towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, with a possible long-term aim of joining up with separatist-controlled territory on the other side. It would not have been the war-ending pocket of previous ambitions, but the move would potentially cut Ukrainian lines of supply to Severodonetsk, and trap as many as half a dozen brigades, mostly National Guard, but some regular military as well. Again, though, this proved to be too much of an objective, and so at the start of May we have the third pincer attempt, this time just west of Severodonetsk. This attack, though limited in scope, has come the closest so far to reaching the objective, creating a sizable pocket on the Donbas front. The advances of the 40th and 336th Naval Infantry, along with the 234th Guards Air Assault Regiment, allegedly spearheaded by the private military organization Wagner Group, near Popasna, has opened up a very threatening salient and is close to severing the only major road connection to Severodonetsk. As far as we know right now, the Ukrainian 24th Mechanized is actively opposing this advance with elements of the 4th Tank Brigade en route to render assistance. Mayhaps this will be enough and yet another Russian advance halted, but This Russian success, localized though it may be, shows that Russia does now have the ability to successfully push through heavily defended Ukrainian areas. Bearing in mind that this part of the front has been one of the most static up until this point, with heavily entrenched Ukrainian troops in long prepared positions. The Russians breaking through this is a big deal. Now, maybe it's a fluke. Maybe it was a mistake on the part of the Ukrainian defender, or a particularly brilliant fight on the Russians' part. Or maybe it is a sign that after 100 days of war, the invader has finally begun to absorb the many harsh lessons doled out by the teacher known as experience. The battle in the city of Severodonetsk itself is exceedingly heavy, with the last few days in particular having been quite the roller coaster ride, as the Russians at first seemed to be pushing out the Ukrainian defenders, but then Ukraine launched a surprise counterattack, which not only halted the Russian advance but even managed to reverse it in many areas after a devastating artillery bombardment that many are now claiming to have been a trap. I don't know if I describe quite that much tactical brilliance to the local commander, especially as ceding large quantities of urban territory tends to be a bad idea in the long run, but nevertheless, the fighting is extremely heavy, and the city's fate is most assuredly hanging in the balance right now. Finally then, let us move on to the bird's eye view of the war and the world. Immediately, we must ask the question, how much longer can the conflict last? President Zelensky recently admitted to perhaps as many as 50 to 100 Ukrainian casualties every day on the Donbas front. Overall estimates suggest somewhere between 10 to 30,000 Ukrainian casualties. Bearing in mind, of course, that casualty does not necessarily mean dead, it is still a substantial number in terms of both those who are actually dead and those who have long-term injuries and wounds making them incapable of fighting, especially to a defending army that numbered some 200,000 men before the war. With the mobilization of reserves, however, that number will have increased more than fourfold. Ukraine is not running out of men anytime soon, though equipment may be another matter. The mobilization armories of Ukraine will no doubt be mighty thin right now, and the war has eaten through hardware at a rate no one had predicted, to the point that the United States has shipped more than a third of all its Javelin anti-tank systems to Ukraine. And even if Javelin production was cranked up to its highest currently theoretically possibly level, 6,000 to 7,000 per year, the Ukrainians are going through them like candy, with the Ukrainian government having requested 500 Stingers and Javelins be delivered every day. 6,000 to 7,000 per year, and they're asking for 500 a day. That's going to be a problem long term. And the same goes for heavier hardware as well. Ukraine asked to purchase 100 Panzerhaubitze 2000s from Germany. The entire German army has 108 of these howitzers. The intensity of the fighting has proven without a shadow of a doubt that current military weapons production is nowhere near the levels required to sustain continuous fighting. Hopefully it will be a wake-up call to many European nations that have neglected their militaries for decades, counting instead on good old Uncle Sam to do all the dirty work. But it is not just the West that's running out of toys. Recently, footage emerged of all the T-62 Soviet-era tanks apparently being transported to Ukraine. I did a video on it, you can watch for more details, but any speculation that these were just training vehicles or unrelated to the war have now been thoroughly dispelled, as the first few T-62 wrecks have shown up in Ukraine. Russia is quite clearly having a hard time replenishing their active armor numbers. The strength of their currently deployed force, too, is questionable. Russia is in the middle of a mobilization that's totally not a mobilization, with the aim presumably to reinforce and replace a lot of the exhausted units currently at the front, with some, like the 35th Combined Arms Army, allegedly, according to Russian leaks, essentially only existing on paper right now, as it has been virtually wiped out as an active combat formation. And on that note, Russian casualties are every bit as hard to determine as the Ukrainian ones, as neither side, of course, wants to broadcast that kind of information. There was, however, a bit of a whoopsie committed by Russian media, with an article being posted appearing to admit to 10,000 dead with another 14,000 wounded after a month of war. The site later claimed to have been hacked and the information to be false, which, think of that what you will. And another unnamed NATO source, yet further pinches of salt there, claimed 14,000 dead and 40,000 wounded back in March. We are unlikely to get any solid numbers until long after the war, if ever, but if we assume these claims are within the rough realm of reason, and I think they could be, and bearing in mind that the Russian attrition has slowed considerably after their withdrawal from the long exposed lines of communication during the Kiev offensive, then a number somewhere north of 50,000 casualties seems not only possible, but probably quite conservative. And these are, as demonstrated by the partial mobilization, not numbers Russia can easily replace. At least not without further extensive drafts. So can the war continue? Yes, absolutely. Ukraine has already mobilized its manpower and can sustain casualties of this order for years. Their primary constraint will be the flow of Western equipment, which Ukraine can pay for, no questions about it. In fact, they can pay for a lot more than they're actually receiving due to massive US and EU aid. But, again, the West has been criminally negligent in its weapons productions for decades. And whilst, make no mistake, there is still much more to give, the demands of modern war has seriously surprised the Western world, to the point that even if Ukraine could pay for 100 Panzerhaubitz, Germany doesn't have 100 of them to give away. On the Russian side, hardware is hardly the issue. So long as quality is not the primary concern, there are thousands of tanks still in Siberia, and to be fair, it is not much harder for a Javelin to destroy a modern, upgraded T-72B3M than it is to destroy a T-62 from the 60s, and the 62 can provide direct fire support just about as well as the 72 can. Russia's primary problem, therefore, is men. Their initial standing army has, by all accounts, been mauled, and frankly, considering the multitude of communications and logistical problems, the near complete failure of air and armored support, along with poor and vulnerable leadership, I am quite genuinely impressed by the common Russian soldier's ability to simply hang on. All glory to the Ukrainians as well, of course. They have performed above and beyond expectations in halting the invasion. But besides intentional large-scale Russian retreats, the Ukrainian army has seemed to struggle just as much on the offensive as the Russians have done. The average Russian soldier has yet again, in my opinion, demonstrated his ability to soldier through some conditions that are practically criminal, frankly. Now, Russia can absolutely replenish its manpower. The potential pool of reservists and conscripts is enormous. But the Russian economy is in a very touchy place right now, and the mass mobilization of hundreds of thousands of extra soldiers might not be a brilliant idea. Now, the currency, the ruble, has, due to extraordinarily strong arming measures initiated by Putin, not only stabilized but actually strengthened itself. This in large part due to Europe's incredibly unwise reliance on Russian oil and gas. A weakness that Europe is only now finally moving to eliminate, though it will take months at best and probably years. Since many European countries have essentially made themselves reliant upon imports of energy by destroying their own energy sectors. How long Putin's strong-arm tactics will work, though, is unclear, as whilst Russian exports remain largely unaffected for the most part at the moment, Russian imports have practically evaporated, and a lot of Russian businesses and industry are reliant upon outside goods. And on the topic of goods and produce, we may very well all be in for one hell of a time soon. Biden's record spending has seen US inflation hit and surpass 8%, an enormous jump from previous years. This now will combine with skyrocketing food prices due to the landlocked Ukrainian exports. And as the cherry on top, we are probably also going to see an energy crisis starting up in Europe and spreading to the rest of the world. Already electricity has hit never before seen record prices here in Norway. And this article you're seeing right here, by the way, says that the prices in some parts of Norway are 100 times higher than others. 100 times. Combined all of these factors together, the money being worth less, food being more expensive, heating and energy being more expensive, and, well, let's just say that if the war drags on for another 3 more months, a lot of people are in for a very hard winter. And unfortunately, there is every reason to suspect the war will drag on. Russia cannot throw in the towel now. It has been humiliated and has just started mobilizing a new wave of soldiers. Simultaneously, Ukraine has lost some 20% of its landmass, and it's equally unlikely to give up now as heavier Western systems are finally on the horizon. Nor do I think one side is in a clear ascendancy either, and able to enforce terms on the other. Ukraine has done incredibly well the last few months, to be sure, but as I just said, Russia still squats on damn near a quarter of the country. And whilst Russia's offensive ability has been in question for quite some time now, the recent breakthrough at Popasna has clearly shown there is still a fight in them yet. So after 100 days plus, the situation as I see it is a stalemate, with everything yet to be fought for. So I guess I'll see you in another 3 months. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.